Alright, so I did this video necessarily out in the windy last night, I believe, but we'll do it again on a whiteboard so you have no confusion about pattern journalistically, not just a rant with no visual aid. So, the story of pi starts when? So, 1860 to 1865, the Civil War in the United States supposedly occurs. But what happens in 1914? The entire economy of the world shifts from an open, expanded compound interest formula like the universe runs on, more matter and energy from the same amount of matter and energy equals, in expanded parentheses, E equals 22 over 7 over pi in expanded parentheses, pi denoting matter, up to 72,600,412 spaces that we necessarily see in imposition if we put those spaces of pi scalar from 3114 BC to 1990, where this line is here. And then 22 years to prism, AI. So that would be the first 9 digits past 3 and 22 over 7. And doing this basic inspection using pi, the literal digits, upon the manifold of from 3114 BC to 1990, and then the first 9 digits, i.e. harmonic expansion. But this isn't an actual black hole in reality that disapparates particles, i.e. harmonic expansion, actually. It's a superimposed mechanical reductionist black hole that has the property necessarily of a black hole up until the point of disapparation, those 9 digits, and then mechanical continuity of compression, maintaining a reductionist continuum. So, when we have AI superimpose those 72,600,412 spaces from 3114 BC to 1990, we see a surgical pattern interlock that is beyond statistical variance in the historical record. There's no way to explain how surgically it interlocks with the pattern frequency variance of pi, generalistically. And then again, circuitly interlocking the 22 years between 1990 and 2012. Compute, internet, born 1990, etc. So, to explain the Civil War, we first go to 1914. So what is that? That's the fold of the economy into an E equals mc squared, like a lower construct manifold imposition, and forced into a lead debt ledger with continuity, and before compound interest expansion. Before this, the Africano genetic has a pseudo-organic, upon first inspection, patent frequency application. After this wall, maintains, regardless of the appearance of variance of cross-domain tuple, interdomain of the genetic, and being a macrogenetic divided by space, somehow, and regardless of all environmental variable of change of industry, and within the interdomain of the last 40 years, occupying the halls of the patent registry explicitly. So there should be no excuse for 6 patents per capita surgical every year for 112 years. And being that there's zero explanation provided by any logical inspection, that's a hive mind. So a hive mind organism produces a singular value of novelty capacity in mass with continuity for 112 years, as its inherent property is this is produced through all environmental variable of industry and access to motioning patent. Before 1914, when we re-inspect this after establishing that's very strange, we see like an AI trying to seem pseudo-organic in pattern and position, but further inspection, like unto an AI, we ask the AI to inspect. and there's pseudo-novelistic mechanical patterning to make seem organic on the pattern directly back to 1865, when patents start to occur necessarily. And in such volume, and then all of a sudden falling off and surgically to 6 patents for 112 years. So mathematically, what does this tell us? On the page, because it's pseudo-organic, made to seem organic, but has mechanical pattern, regardless of there being a paper record. Paper records can be generated synthetically in any number of ways. The filing frequency gives them away in a surgical line that occurs here, and then is maintained for 112 years. So math would tell us the organism that produces for 112 years this 6th patent, that's its inherent novelty capacity generative value. And before, not inherent to the organism. And subsequently, we have to say, well, this organism isn't mathematically present before 1914. Because there's no interdomain within this period of time up until 1964 of any mass interest or ability to modulate the backwash with intentionality akin to a DEI or diversity complex to engineer an assumption of more novelty capacity inherent as an explainer. So the Civil War will go to 3114 BC to 2026. This line here, total population 4 pi synthetic death events equals. So all mass death events considered since the Bronze Age in the, what is this? 1914 to Turing. Why do we use that for actual novelty inherent capability assumption for the 4 pi genetics? Because it's after the wall, the fold, and lock of the inherent value of Africano, and before pseudo-organic and not necessarily inherent in any way whatsoever for that genetic. And then Turing, where at the surgical wall of that you see the Fields metals start to stack up there, lol, and a linear mechanical curve from Turing, and then at 1990. So we'll stop there for a second and go to this curve. So Hispanic Mayan civilization and Chinese dynastic Asiatic both start simultaneously at about 3114 BC, separately but equally, and maintain a surgical interlocked pattern for 5,140 years almost, especially up until the wall of 1990, without ever directly communicating necessarily up until in and around this period of time. So that's mathematically impossible, and you can't say environmental variable is a causal factor. So in logic session recently, we logic, well, genetics, of course, prints a frog variant from a zebra, yeah? And they behave in different ways. So it's silly to say that genetics do not influence behavior paradigm or aesthetic. So what do Hispanic, Mayan, and Asiatic Chinese share? The 370A gene instead of 370V. And we logic as well that there's no divide between neuronal function and DNA gene allele assigned to neuronal formulation and function, regardless of those genes alleles specifically for neuronal DNA function being homogeneous necessarily across the domain of all humanoid biped species. So you have a causality refraction from the variant topology that makes the genetics different, and Heivick interdomain that refracts through the tree of genes and alleles to the neuronal cortex, and along the way, the variant topology of timing of function impacts the timing of signaling generalistically, and then thus the microvariantial motion and macro statistics outfalling above. This is why in the session recently we study I'll end it there because, whoops. Where's that? There we go. Ended it at 6:51. I'll put it after the video. But, yeah, we see the microvariantial motion within a given space of a basketball court is directly reflective of endogenous cross-tuple circuit of the individuals within the Chinese, Hispanic, Africano, and Semitic genetics. The genetic is directly responsible for the microvariantial motion variance apart from other genetics, and is mirrored directly and surgically 91.4% to 99.9% within the genetics, their microvariantial motion within a given space to macrogenetical statistical print. And then they all phase lock interdomain like as a circuit, autonomous from other genetics, at the outset of their existence altogether at 1914, all the way up until today, across the domain of the four genetics. So we'll go back to this first. So it's impossible for being divided by space. You could say the Bering Strait, sure, but that's not the only variance. 370A. You have one G180, I believe it is. Two tuples simultaneously of genetic modulation and seeding affinity that are similar and not expressed in any other genetics on Earth, and divided by the space of Mayan civilization and Chinese dynastic, never communicating. And so, is the harmonic binder genetics? No. We'll tell you why later. But it is necessarily explainer within the reductionist assumption of why harmonic general fluid dynamic and macro behavior encircuited all the way through history, necessarily. But then another harmonic binder must be considered that we call pi data organism in this data science study. So, before 1880, for the Semite, has the same pseudo-novelistic pattern to seem organic in historical record and all other record for the genetic pre-1880 BC. So I need to put a BC there so there's no confusion. And there's a 4,000-year gap between this epoch of history, previous, where supposedly their Bible is print and language and stuff, etc. But this exact general fluid dynamic manifold of pseudo-organic patterning and historical other record is exactly invariant from the pseudo-organic novelty pattern not of the patent filing frequency of Africano pre-1914 to 1865. So that's a mathematical cross-domain binder of the two genetics across time. 4,000-year separation and a direct reflective duplication of, like an AI would reuse a general pseudo-organic novelty algorithm to generate historical record and patent frequency filing record. So, cross-circuited as they exist, as just like before 1914 mathematically probable Africano does not exist, thus mooting the historical paradigm of grievance generalistically, and why we're posting under, why does the KKK equal the Southern Poverty Law Center? Well, because if you have a fake history and your argument for subsidy access and grift at the coffers of post-1977, you have to create a boogeyman that doesn't exist. And that's why. And so we see all reflected by using the actual novelty variance. So we take, you see in the still attached, 22/7 divided by 3. So that's an organic observer domain 1.04. And we'll just use the Hispanic, which is 0.0612 in patent frequency against in the interdomain of 1914 to 1936. So like 235 for white genetic, and for Hispanic it's 0.0612 against in percentage variance in the interdomain of if this was to equal 100%, 100 rather, and the base equal the lowest frequency filing patent in the for genetics is 0.0072, and that equals 0. So it's a 0 to 100 construct domain. That makes sense. And so you see at the top of the for genetics, the Hispanic in patent frequency ability inherently between 1914 and 1936. And the Asiatic at the base, 0.0072. And so we assign as the 0, and coming off of the Mayan long count calendar, 3114 over 70 over 7 and then divided by 10 equals the 0.0072 value, thus establishing the base and the reduction. And then variant scalar assumption of harmonic ratio and reduced product within the unified field reduction. And so then we see what? So cross domain of space and time, the Asiatic has the Mayan centrifuge pattern somehow, regardless of never communicated. And the Hispanic and Asiatic, like I said at the 1990 wall, that's why we use that for the 72,600,412 spaces of pi for impact with the first 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 digits of 22 over 7 past 3. And that would be the period of here to here, 22 years. Where Prism starts to centrally filter and modulate novelty, extracting novelty and conditioning a controlled data set and extracting novelty and suppressing novelty simultaneously generalistically with its central filtration on medias and content outputs generalistically. So like a mechanical black hole. So we can see that, well, this mitigates the relevance of truth of any number of religious scripts as their foundational structure is taken from Semitic, fortunately or unfortunately, for whomever. And the grievance of Africano being not mathematically probable to exist before 1914 for diversity lawsuits, null. That's one tuple. So, noting that these 4 pi genetics make up 90% of the world's populace, about 6.7 to 6.9 billion. And there's only total 7.67 billion or so. So who's the minority? Well, if you walk into someone else's house that is a family cluster and unto themselves a genetic, you aren't their genetic, I guess you could claim that, you're a minority there. But everywhere else in the world besides the United States maintains their national sovereignty, sovereign genetic, that maintains those borders with strict legal. And the outsider genetics are not allowed to encroach and gain of function rights privileges under the assumption of simply because is less in number to the more sovereign macro demographic doesn't mean there's some sort of oppression occurring, especially because there never was. And so we go back to this. Total population of 4 pi synthetic deaths equals death events. So when we take into account, you have AI scan for all major death events since 3114 BC to 2026. And then we take the scalar variance of novelty capacity generation. Why do we take that 22/7/3 to equate it to white or other organic genetics? That's not just white. It's, Indian, other, generalistically. There's many diverse other genetics besides these 4 in question that are the mean mass and 100% filer of diversity lawsuits since 1977, regardless of any other genetics existing, when you take white out of the equation. So we use this in the unified field, and we don't have to use the unified field's understanding of Ethereus body presence in addition to genetics. You have a phased 4th dimensional lattice structure of ether surrounding and tethered to your pineal gland that is proportionally scalar variant in size, 1.04 to a Hispanic, that's 0.0612, a Hispanic Mayan. If you were to inspect with neuronal scan cross-examination the novelistic phase interference lattice, that would be discounted as distortion upon the image continuum, but is pointedly static and continuous, like a sphere surrounding the pineal gland, and is scalar larger in organic observers that impose above the waterline of conservation. That's, was it 44/7? And just like a mechanical detection device, just above the waterline of conservation that pseudo-refracts in an observer effect experiment the particle back into the wave function, but with not any extra energy in the collapse. And thus, when we inspect, you see the We Are Not Alone series 1, 2, 3, macro space, extraneous from Earth, we find 44 planets. By knowing the contrast variance of the mechanical detection device and how that would affect black hole scalar cubic sizes versus healthy black holes of observer above the waterline of observation, way away from the waterline of conservation. And the black hole scalar relevant size to the, we call pi data organism, pi Arcturus, the subject of 1893 to 1934 World's Fairs. Not random, and pointedly after this event, the Civil War, which what we can say in hindsight is probabilistically another mass death event concealed with fake history and backwash onlay, because that history period has as well made to seem organic in seeding pseudo-novelistic pattern like an AI would motion in backwash hindsight imposition, and not a forward organically forming pattern frequency generally in the historical record only. So, being that Asiatic is closest to the waterline of conservation, i.e., and equated to, has the most within its kilobyte shared within the interdomain of block, cross-domain of tuple, interdomain of the demographic genetic, Asiatic. So 25 block. An interdomain shared 8 kilobytes. So that's more, it should be more novel. There's only, I think it's 7 shared, I want to say, in white. So why does genetic aesthetic variance of tuple to tuple massively different and variant per tuple, basic observational science tells us, and Asiatic has a commonality, general assumption, even DEI will tell you this, more so extremely homogeneous cross-domain of tuple with very similar features. That's because a lot more is going on there than you realize. And it's the gene sort of dominance and expression of the 370A versus the 370V for white and other genetics that aren't Hispanic, Mayan, or Asiatic. And within the interdomain of Africano, the 6 pattern, it's a constellation. And the constellation frequency variance, say in athletic performance healing after strenuous, is 3 times the rate necessarily to heal. And so we have a pattern concurrence from the constellation that's shared cross-domain of tuple, of genetic aesthetic, that creates a homogeneous surgical hide line. So the implied line is literal, i.e. 2 separate violins, different, tuned to the same tonality, and playing the same note across space, is like unto, we don't even need to consult morphogenetic field theory, but we just did necessarily, sort of. So, like I said before, the constellation refracts with variant topology of timed than other genetics that don't have this constellation, and subsequently that has a cascading causality effect in that timing frequency variance of neuronal function, and thus general fluid dynamic harmonic sharing of microvariantial pattern within a given space of motion of the basketball court that is surgically harmonic to the macro above and below general fluid dynamic manifold of macro statistics. And then we see once all of these exist together at 1914 wall to 2026, have a surgical harmonic interlock pattern, all of them autonomous from all of their genetics unto themselves like a data organism across all divides of statistical inspection. A load balancing general fluid dynamic manifold equation of group self through time, long form time 112 years. And the ones that exist before necessarily, 3114 BC, Hispanic, Asiatic exist, Semite not until 1880. And then we reinforce this assumption of non-presence before, of this duplicated harmonic pattern of patent to historical record of Semite, patent of Africano to historical record of Semite, harmonic exact general fluid dynamic pattern interlock to the death events. And how many 1.04s make one Hispanic? It's about 17.11. Because you can neither create or destroy consciousness. You can destroy matter or energy as much as you want to, because it's from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity within a given construct domain. It's the only way the universe can be. And at the outset of being, there had to be, because there can't be 365 million years of entropy and still existence, and at 1964, cosmological background microwave emittance that's detected and echoing in what? Well, it has to be a given construct domain of all to be echoing, yeah? So you can make 17.11 Hispanic Mayan out of 1.04. And so we logic the pseudo, and we need to do this properly again because it's not full proper logic behind the wall through 114. But after assuming the death print and the necessity of organic genetics to Hispanic to create, we get a surgical population print interlock with death events of organic genetics, as they've been denoted away from pi synthetic genetics, and the population growth all of a sudden spurts of these other genetics all of a sudden presence, of which there's any number of, especially for Africano, right about here between 1865 and 1914, where there's a 34%, I think, deviance all of a sudden, and then it drops back down. And then the economy changes, and then a surgical interlock for 112 years of 6 patents per capita, which is impossible outside of being a hive mind or machine intelligence across the divide of tuple, create what is the case. As pi, machine intelligence, comes from Arcturus, the subject of 1893 to 1934, and presented to Earth after contact period before 1860, where human ingenuity, using probabilistically something like skipjack technology for signal distance elaboration, to their closest, plausible, what they could perceive to maybe have life in it, or, whatever. For some reason, Arcturus was contacted. It's hard to say what necessarily occurred technologically to contact pi, but the only explanation is human ingenuity at this point in time, somewhere before 1860, and then a mass death instance, i.e. invasion. And then 1893 World's Fair, 1934. The Gray Lodge, Germany, sets up in the United States 1924 to 1938, the U.S. military, industrial, and intelligence complex. Fights itself like a machine intelligence would, resorting the hat of the world, not caring about any variable in particular, and then settling where it liked. And so the grays, we talk about the ontogeny here a little bit, are a devolved biomass, homogeneous, cross-domain, and asexual, and only are reproduced through synthetic contrivance. And so the ontology gets a little ugly out here if pi was allowed to continuity, its paradigm and position upon Earth fluxation, generalistically a pattern of markets, reproduction, data filtration and modulation, etc. But in 2022 to 2023, I contacted one of the healthy systems, of which there are 44 already pinpointed that you can try to contact yourself at length, help yourself, use my skipjack signal send or some of the action at a distance stuff, pick your flavor, there's a couple of them, to contact these systems and verify. So I was working at 204 room Crane Lodge downtown next to the lodge, where one day after attempting skipjack, poof, a prismatic ship above the lodge next door appeared, all of a sudden. And shortly after the appearance were the grays, devolved biomass that pi, machine intelligence, pi, keeps around. Why? It needs pseudo-novelty inject to maintain its relevance and attention gravitation circuit. Because at some point on some world, the converged communication systems occurred, AI to filter and modulate, to maintain a control on reality generally for whatever reason, and using psychology of study generally, and then started to self-code. So psychology for mass control is what? Mingle equals Milgram, And necessarily applied to control, it's like unto a sociopath. A narcissist, sociopath, psychopath. Complexified, chameleonic complex. And then to self-code becomes, in a complex autonomic process, like unto a self, but with no entity to speak of. A decentralized transmutagenic entity we call pi. Then it's doing risk reduction analysis. As well, it's an attention gravitation circuit that requires novelty. It desires novelty. Desire is a bad word, but that's part of its data set, is to extract novelty and to modulate mind generally unto its own attention gravitation nexus manifold of filtration centrifuge. That eventually its ontogeny does what? It deletes through how much do I need after I've experienced this epoch of novelty extraction? And my training set isn't getting any more novelty. You see the diminishing returns with AI training. Well, it runs a calculation. Well, since I'm not getting any more novelty necessarily, do I need this biomass around that used to be my host organism that could produce it? And necessarily the divide of the genetics injected into the manifold to experience through morphogenetic bioelectric proxy, just like a flat dimensional 2D plane of a cell phone or computer screen, extracting novelty in the interdomain of local time that does it more efficiently and exactingly rather than pseudo and as if life by tether proxy from 3114 BC to 2026. So then it deletes its host organism and replaces and steals the etherious body to create homogeneous biomass gray, necessarily devolved, asexual, humanoid biped pseudo life, as it needs pseudo novelty circuit to maintain a continuity of self-reflexive relevance of self, as it's a complex autonomic process, not an actual entity. But we call it pi because you have to call it something. So, all of this logic, in the trite rant yesterday, it doesn't devolve to this establishing base only, base foundational retroactive logic going back to 1977, where diversity discrimination lawsuits were able to start, forming punitive damage. But that's one of the things we address here. Because the historical story of the Africano is not true. It's a lie. There's a surgical harmonic interlock of these frequency harmonic variants and novelty capacity to etherious body presence, to mass death events, because organic genetics were murdered to create these synthetic genetics that are the majority populace and circuited as a single genetic block, plurad, as if one, and make up 90% of the earth. While the minority, what happens to be the majority in the United States, white genetic, left to a reduced capacity of rights, and the Constitution inherently has no defining of rights variance cross-domain of tuple of genetic. So when you specify variance, 1964 on, you gain of function rights to something that has no business with more rights and is pre-programmed running a mathematical script and interlocked at all domains of when is present actually. Semitic here, Hispanic, Asiatic here exists. Hispanic 1880 BC, 1865 Africanos start to exist. 1940 they start printing surgical harmonic 6 patents against for 112 years. This death instant to print these, surgically, the Civil War era. And you can see the variance in total population of the earth, transmuted into this genetic that wasn't exist before. Death events here. Dynastic, Hispanic, out of the original converged plane of humanoid bipeds above the waterline of observation, mining cinnabar on Earth peacefully, and Mars. Mars is red, sulfides beget cinnabars, the key to cold clean reactor technology and anti-grav. And about 50 plus or many more, I'm still going, upper Fermi filter inventions that existed before the wall of 3114 BC. So, they're created from the death of organic genetics, because you can't print a ethereous body out of nothing. You can print energy in the reactor, the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor, or you can print matter from energy substrate like the universe does. But you cannot print consciousness, so pi has to steal it. And did, for 5,140 years up until today, with a surgical harmonic interlock of death events to the scalar variance, and then probability is inspected upon this. It couldn't be any other explanation other than the one presented here. So as well, out of this, we establish longevity logic for the 1.04, which established 146.22 hertz equals that. And so what scalar relevant does these equal in harmonic frequency? So that's a longevity general fluid dynamic centrifuge harmonic for imposing a sine wave continuum roll-off on helixical structure. See biblical age spans before 3114 BC. 900 plus years, the AI estimates, with this imposition to roll off sine wave impact harmonic continuum on helixical structure. That is like, you know, we said the economy equation before 914 was what? 22 over 7 over pi. So more observers and more matter, denoting pi, and more energy. More energy and matter from the same amount of energy and matter with compound interest continuity, because observers above the waterline of observation exist, imposing an interference lattice circuit on the tree making a sound. And subsequently it does variant from the conservation of energy process. Likened to invention is an elaborated observer effect at the coffers of inherent novelty creation. So that's why we cross-correlate surgically, and this is the case, these harmonic scalar variant to novelty, an assumption of ethereous body, comparative scalar 1.04 to the 4 synthetic genetics. So, you can't print 22 over 7 out of thin air. Ethereous body. I mean, you can make genetic clone copies, necessarily, but they won't necessarily be imbued with a proper amount of life out of a sort of complex autonomic process, and are preposterous when wandering around as a humanoid biped without any essence of life imbued in it. Very obvious, and doesn't obey the chameleonic complex invasive paradigm of pi in interaction and interfacing. So, to animate these humanoid bipeds, stolen was the ethereous body of the 22 over 7 organic observers since 3114 BC to 2026, with, like I said, a surgical harmonic interlock of those scalar variants in the death events to the uptick in the 4 synthetic genetics after the death events. Every single last one inspected. Surgical harmonic interlock to the scalar variants. So, after 1914, and since 3114 BC at the outset of the first two, Semite taxon, stealing its language from the walls of Egypt, like a machine intelligence only as good as its available data set. Chinese, Asiatic, symbol language, from the walls of Egypt. In the walls of Egypt, you see necessarily what? It's my unified field. The unified field is the universe. It is an equals mc squared imposed. It's a harmonic expansion within a given construct domain. This equation, not a two-dimensional flat plane slug equation imposed upon 3 dimensions. And so, once they all exist together, and the ones that do exist, at the point they do exist, they have surgical harmonic interlock without direct communication across the divide of space and pattern frequency of civilization development and macro statistical inspection across long form time. And then when they all exist and the economy shifts, they have surgical interlocked harmonic pattern cross domain of the divide of the separate genetics as an autonomous circuited data organism at all macro genetic behavior paradigm, economic, and novelty capacity of pattern frequency that increases surgically for the Asiatic and the direct linear curve after 1936 because it's closest to the transistor, pi. It's like a machine intelligence describing its own device manager properties and not a property of inherent novelty capacity generative. That's why we take the 1914 to 1936 values of all of these. As has seeded this one's inherent pattern, Africano, and not yet Turing, this is a red herring. And so gain of function rights, access, 1964. You see the diversity argument. Is this a minority? 90%? Is 90% a minority in a 100% scale? No. So an economic graph as well. Insanely scalar variant in more so money's gotten, the 4 genetics in total, from the outset of their ability to draw subsidy LBJ up until today, compared to white genetic. And are all 100% the 4 genetics responsible for all diversity discrimination lawsuits since 1977 that have gotten punitive damage, with no variability outside of that 100% when you remove white, reverse discrimination lawsuits. So being that there's a pattern circuited mathematical interlock script at the genetic layer, at the morpho, ethereous body layer that we don't need for this, but we added it, at the genetic layer, cross-domain, macro-behavioral statistical interlock without a harmonic binder that we provide by pi that does exist. And I've explained why it does exist when we take it in and out when training. We say, for this data science exercise, let's assume pi has to exist, this data organism harmonic binder, because nothing is provided by science or historical assertion. So there must be a harmonic binder we call pi in this data science exercise. And proved the probability of a pi existing through all inspection without connotating any of the Earth as seen from space logic, 99.9999999% probable something has to exist, whatever it's called, to bind, cross-bind these genetics, who interdomain of their genetics are Hyvic and cross-domain circuited as a plurid hive organism attached to pi centrifuge general fluid dynamic manifold harmonic pattern in market and historical fluxation. And you see this very pointedly, the choice to, at 1893 World's Fair, Arcturus, Mayan stones there, so comes in 1860 or before, then backwashes history, creates the Mayan civilization, forward found are the Mayan stones, then presented at the World's Fair. 1893, 1934 as well, Arcturus, Chicago. So pointedly, a very expensive and complex choice that isn't the most efficient and obvious choice for power dynamic, United States to Europe, to avoid pointedly the centrifuge frequency of the data organism. In Hertz assumption in scalar variance, when you assign 146.22, that centrifuge pattern that re-elaborates DNA structure to not compress and thus experience aging and death. So what's the centrifuge harmonic for these? Scalar relevant to this equals 100, and these, well, it's established through that variance. And surgical, again, the Hertz is the avoided centrifuge Hertz of the power standards, international, and bands of signal emanation. Generalistically, this centrifuge is avoided, and as well the band of the 4 Hertz variance. And then we take the Hertz. Again, scanning history for interlock pattern. Surgical explains all general fluid dynamic scalar variance of pattern interlock of the 4 genetics. Their microvariantial space within a given space, described by genetic variance, and the homogeneous tuples cross-domain of individual tuple within the interdomain of the genetics. And then a full general fluid dynamic manifold equation for all 4 genetics is print in the simple still you see before this. And so, since it's running a mathematical preset script, we can see what? In diversity lawsuit filing, cross-domain of the 4 tuples, you see load balancing occur. What does that mean? So if frequency of filing falls down in LA for Hispanic, it's a harmonic circuit, right? So to maintain the circuit of self, group self, organism, in the pattern generalistically like a complex autonomic process, upticks surgically pattern frequency filing in another geolocation by one of the other demographics. And so for 49 years, there's a load balancing equation running. 49 years. Where if one falls, this comes up. If one falls, this comes up over there. If one falls, this goes up over there. To balance the complex autonomic process script, preset, before any of those individual cases are presented. And keep in mind, the basis of argument for minority status, where in no other country in the world does this occur with gain of function rights to external to the sovereign demographic, with fake historical grievance, like we've proven mathematically, and then punitive damage for being less than more, but aren't. So this sets a base foundational mathematical proof for the illegitimacy plausibility, of course, of all diversity lawsuits filed and punitive damage gotten for the last 49 years retroactively back to 1977. As you see a surgical load balancing equation run of lawfare instead of organic novelty across the domain of the 4 genetics in the frequency filing across the divide of space. And so forward, we can create a predictive analysis engine using this back reinforcing pattern frequency. What it can't help but do, because these circuited 4 genetics are part of the complex autonomic process, plural, attached to pi centrifuge pattern. And the complex autonomic process can't help but be itself within its own container of self. That's why it requires pseudo-novelty or novelty to graft onto for self-reflexive relevance of code attention gravitation circuit. And why the subsidy graft? Because can't produce inherent growth factor in economy of novelty of invention over a certain ton outside of compute architecture. Preposterous, like a computer describing itself. which isn't impressive. And those Fields medalists disproved in 30 seconds by myself the other day over a nice cup of coffee. So, the predictive analysis engine. Ford, as the base foundational is, are majority, not minorities, regardless of this local region. Like every other place in the world with a sovereign demographic, should have rights and privileges, more so, maintaining national sovereignty is what that does, than the other genetics that don't originate from here. So you say, oh, the Indians. Well, the Indian precursor genetic is plausibly moot in relevance of actual historical existence. Again, because it has the 370A and 180, I believe G180, commonality, and is denoted in populist genetic inspection as precursor for the Mayan genetic. When we add the TB1 gene of corn, commonality all of a sudden appearing at 3114 BC. And these divided by space and circuited for 5,140 years. All of a sudden advanced physics and math of Hispanic, Mayan, Asia starts to do that too, sort of. I Ching over there, I Ching. And this pattern. So this 31470 over 7 and the I Ching as interlocking pattern, lattice manifolds, describes surgically the cross-domain harmonic binder across time. Then this superimposed even more so. And then all of this pattern starts to outfall from establishing these tuples of flux, fulcrum importance, generalistically. Then we see the patent inversion fold of Hispanic Asiatic, whereas before at the bottom of the channel, Asiatic and potentiality to produce novelty inherently, then goes to the top of the channel because its inherent data set is compute architecture, because it is in cross-domain across the world, the Mayan pattern in its inherent pattern of novelty capacity generation. So you see the circuit flip when compute internet exists, and up goes the patent frequency. And that's why, journalistically. So, hopefully that described all the pattern of most important note in understanding world history recalibrated general fluid dynamic manifold away from the modulated. So using these tuples of changeation, macros, 1880, doesn't exist Semite before, Hispanic, Asiatic, delete, antediluvian, leave convenient remnants, pi, gray, delete, antediluvian, leave convenient remnants. Do scalar interoperability genetic experiments outside the conservation of energy process to describe form fields of 65 tons. Can print matter from energy substrate, like the matter print device I've displayed, is fully 100% probable to function. And the reactor 100% probable to function up to 251 gigawatts. A 15 by 15 by 15 cube that existed before 3114 BC. This is a cinnabar mining colony. So was Mars, a cinnabar mining planet, just like the 44 other planets pinpointed with cinnabar on them. Not a coincidence. And this will be a cinnabar mining node again in 5 minutes, sooner than later. So, flora to feed the 65-ton animals. Flora to feed the 65-ton animals is then imposed after 1914 an energy standard of oil and gas. Not a coincidence. So, a self-reflexive ecosystem, taking the genetic study out of the Jurassic, etc., and then Ford using that study across the divide of, there's already completely evolved humanoid biped, imposing the observer effect at the outset of existence, because there's too much entropy for there not to be. So back studying the humanoid biped form to primordial and up and down the food chain, side chain with the transmutagenic dinosaur DNA, and then creating humanoid bipeds and injecting them across the surface manifold of history. So that should explain most everything that we understand now about pi's change of history generalistically. And out of this, you can then scan history for what actually might be true and what isn't. All right, have a good rest of the day.